Hi folks, my name's Jemma Hooper. I am your host for this session of the Writers CONduit convention. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you're having a great time at the con so far and that you've had lots of use and good content out of the con. This is our RPG game writing panel, and we'll be up for 2 hours, and then we'll be raiding out to the map making panel, which will be in a couple of hours' time. As I said, my name's Jemma Hooper. I am a trans, neurodivergent, ADHD person, apparently, because I can't keep a thought in my head. And also, what was the other thing? Trans, neurodivergent, disabled. That's the one. Writer, music producer, streamer, etc. And you have me as your host for the next couple of hours. Let's introduce you to our panel, though. We have with us, from left to right, DMStretch, DinosaurBob, and GamezGM, aka Dan.
Hello,
guys,
everyone.
Maybe if you could just go left to right and give us a quick introduction of yourselves and how it is that you've come to be part of this panel.
So I'm guessing that's me first. I am DMStretch. A lot of you know me. I'm a TTRPG material writer and world builder. I write a lot of homebrew things on my stream. Sorry, if I'm on Twitch under DMStretch. I'm also on Twitter, Instagram, got a Facebook page, and we're on Discord. Occasionally feature on other people's streams as the players and games, things as and when I can. I like a good game. And that's about it. And lead on to you, Bob.
Okay, I'm RPGDinosaurBob. Some places it's just DinosaurBob. Bob O'Brien is the name, actually. I have been game mastering and role-playing and involved in role-playing games for 45 years, hence the dinosaur, since the very beginning, and we'll be hearing about that in a minute. I am the last-minute panel lead. We were supposed to be led by Graham Barber. I'm going to just mention him, but unfortunately he was called away for real-life work, you know, that horrible, terrible thing that all of us try to avoid as much as possible. And that's about it. You know, that's basically it. Again, you will also find me on Twitch as RPGDinosaurBob. You can find me in World Anvil as DinosaurBob. And let's just move on.
I suppose I'm next. Bringing up the rear, as always, I think is the saying. My name is Games, and I can be found on Twitch as GamezGM, because some sod had already stolen Games. But I'm known as Games everywhere else. Games on World Anvil, on Discord, and a number of other places. I, similar to Dinosaur Bob and DM, am a TTRPG writer, and also an academic writer and author. Hopefully a number of you have seen me for a number of the panels and bits and bobs we've run throughout Writers Con. Obviously I was running this morning copyright. Yes, the super sexy topic that everyone wanted to know about. Yes, that was me. But obviously, as always, very important. Forearmed is forewarned. We're now going to be going on to writing RPG writing.
Yes,
I think
we are.
That we all love.
Yes, and the topic that I think we're all here for was kind of a nebulous one. You know, I mean, RPG game writing, I believe, was the official title. And what does that mean? First of all, I want to point out that, again, the hobby has been around, I think, as a recognized hobby for at least 45 years. And as I said, I got in right at its birth. I mean, I was introduced to this wonderful game called this wonderful game called Chainmail, that had a new set of extension rules made up by this guy named Gary Gygax somewhere out in Wisconsin. Chainmail was a tabletop miniatures medieval warfare simulation game. So you put your little metal knights and your little metal archers on a table and move them around and all that. And Gary and his friends came up with the thought one day: what would happen if we had a magic user in the back with the artillery? So they literally threw together a quick set of rules for how to incorporate magic into a medieval war game, and published it. And it was a big hit. And it basically, before the concept of something going viral, that went viral shortly after they published Dungeons and Dragons. And we're not talking first edition. They didn't call it first edition. It was Dungeons and Dragons only edition back then. This was back in the days when elf was a class. All right, so that's where I got started.
Isn't that where your name comes from, Dinosaur?
Well, that's why there's a dinosaur in my name. Yes, exactly. Obviously, we've come a long, long, long way in the hobby. All right, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different game systems. There are thousands, if not tens of thousands, of different game worlds to play in. And they've gotten more complex. Back then, those first games, it was literally, the dungeon master threw together a bunch of rooms in a dungeon that had absolutely no coherence from one to the other. You open up the door in room 1 and there's 12 goblins. You open up the door in room 2 and there's 6 ogres, and nobody ever asked why the ogres hadn't already eaten the goblins. Or did the goblins work for the ogres? You didn't care about that way back then. Nowadays, we're building whole story plots and whole lines, and things have to make sense. So it's gotten a lot more complex. So writing RPG, has definitely evolved in the last 45 years, and hopefully I'm evolving better than the dinosaurs did. I like to think of myself as, although I symbolize myself with one of the herbivorous dinosaurs, I like to think of myself more like the velociraptor line that turned into birds and is still with us. So anyway, we've
probably more like the lizard that kind of crawls along the surface.
Crocodile.
We've got a couple hours to try to cover a few things. Well, an hour and 45 minutes now. So there's basically 3 main directions you can take the topic of writing RPGs. We could be writing adventures for existing worlds. We could be writing whole new worlds and adventures in them. Or we could be writing whole new rule systems. All right. There's really those 3 different aspects. So over the course of the next hour and 45 minutes, we're going to see if we can at least touch on all of those. And we'll see where things take us. So I want to get started with a couple of basics, though, things that kind of transcend all 3 of those. I mentioned before the early history, RPGing, it was all about the combat system. You open the door and there's the goblins. What do? I hit them with my sword. Nowadays, I think things are a bit more complicated.
I think it depends who you play with.
Well, yes.
What do you do? Hit it.
But, the big issue, is the big one you hear nowadays. DM, you can this was your suggestion. What's the biggest question when it comes to writing RPGs or an RPG adventure? You know,
The first rule set.
Yeah.
But once you got that down, setting. What is the setting of the game that you're playing? Not necessarily the world. That can always come later. I built my Darmoria world off a one-shot because I needed the building that was focused in, so I built that. And the building has to be somewhere, so I built the town. And agile world building from there.
Right. But the adventures themselves, I mean, it was okay long ago to just, for the DM to literally plan, you're going to open this door, and then you're going to open that door, and then you're going to open this door. And that's all anybody expected and all anybody knew. But nowadays, players are expecting rich worlds, and they want to explore them.
I think the key word there really is, and to steal it from Miss Forbes, Janet, from World Anvil, is it's an immersive world. People want to see a expanse of realism in what they're playing. Obviously, it's not a game on your computer. You have limitations to what you obviously can make that be, but having a connected view across a world where your actions have ramifications. If you push the king of Saldonia into the lava, nobody's just going to go, oh well. So there's got to be ramifications when you are RPG writing, considering the lineality of the world and considering, like we all do, the player agency, amongst other things, which I know we're coming on to later.
Yeah, well, player agency is actually, I think, the big thing. It's one of the driving forces behind the complexity that we need now. All right, and all four of us have had some experience in game mastering. Jemma, what the groups that you work with or play with, what's their feeling for? Are they comfortable with railroaded adventures, or do they want to actually explore?
It depends. I've had some groups that wanted enough detail in the universe to be able to pick their own pathway through it. Others have wanted to be led by the nose into a specific adventure path, and it ultimately actually is very much something that needs to be negotiated between the group and the GM. There's also a balance, I think, to be struck between immersion and agency. So you can actually make an experience very immersive without necessarily giving people a sense of being able to make their own decisions about what they're doing within that context. By good world building, providing a lot of good descriptive content, that sort of thing. Talking about different senses like smell and taste and touch, as well as what they see and what they hear. But yes, agency is important. It has been a problem with some of the groups that I've had where they've wanted to dig into something that I had no content prepared for, and basically didn't want to take no for an answer. But we live and learn.
There's nothing better than winging it on the fly.
Yeah,
yeah.
Like
DM
brain shifting to another realm.
Well, I didn't do that, did I?
I'm personally of the opinion that as a game master, all right, if my responsibility is to come up with an adventure for people to follow, now this is I can see I'm going to anticipate the chat going nuts for a second, but hear me out. You almost there's no such thing as a true sandbox. All right, if you're asking me to write adventures, then I'm not going to write 47 adventures and let you pick one and not have them connected to each other or anything. You know, I'm going to create an adventure, a story arc. I'm going to drive you down that story arc. All right. So, am I going to be kind of railroading you? Yes, I am. The real art is in how well I can camouflage the tracks.
Yeah.
So that you don't know you're on a track. And so that even if you do go left when I was hoping you'd go right, I can get you back on that track. All right. And that's the real challenge in RPG adventure writing, I think, these days. All right. Because you still got to get to that end point. All right. But we have to learn as adventure writers how to break up the bits so that we can move them around if we need to. You know, oh, this was supposed to happen in this tavern in this village, but they went a different way, so pick it up and move it. You know, we can't get so locked into our world creation. I think sometimes.
Yeah.
So I don't know what other tricks are there. My trick for that, like I said, is to try to make encounters as small and compartmental as possible, so that they can just be picked. You know, if they went around it here, I could pick it up and put it somewhere else and still put it in their way, you know, without them realizing it. Does anybody else have any other tricks for doing?
I do.
That sort of thing, you know, for camouflaging the tracks, as I call it.
Yeah. I don't. Rather than camouflage tracks, I don't actually have a track. I have waypoints. I want to be here at this point, and they want to be here at this point. How they get there, it's entirely up to them. Okay, so I want them to go right, they go left. Well, okay, it goes like that. The path then, it always leads to that waypoint. But they just feel, especially on a one-shot, you need to have the waypoints more than the campaign, but you just need to guide them along to the next point, really.
I think it's about having those touch points, isn't it? I'm a big believer of trying not to railroad people, but you do have to set some boundaries, right? You can't counter for everything. Like the example given there, we were attacked by, I think, this demon deity thing. Correct me if I'm wrong, DM there. Yeah. And I was like, well, sod this, fine, I'll just piss off to another dimension.
Yeah.
So...
The one based on the Hex race, yes.
And I was like, well, fine, I'll just use a Dominion door, bye. So I think it's somewhat trying to interpret what your players want. And to steal a line from Great GM, Sky Scandaler, it's have a really good session zero. Understand what your players want from your activities. Understand your players before you even start building your campaign. There's no point building a campaign or building a series or even a one-shot if your players want to play cowboys and you're telling them, no, you are going to be a chef in a castle serving the king. You're never going to go along the same level of experience and player agency. So having those conversations where you've got clear delineation of expectations is, I think, the real key when doing RPG writing and running one-shots, campaigns, things like that. Then write for your needs. I think one big thing, like we all say, is you end up starting to write about elven shoes when you haven't even worked out the full main plot yet. So I think maintain that focus on what you need to deliver and give player agency, but have rough waypoints of where you want the story to go.
All right. I think the other thing that's important besides the whole railroad sandbox thing, the games themselves these days have gotten a little more complex. And again, as I said, in history, it was just Combat 1, Combat 2, Combat 3, let's break for snacks, Combat 4, Combat 5. Nowadays, there are definitely parts of the game that are not combat. All right, and this definitely goes back to knowing your table, I think. The exploration, and some game systems, spend a lot of time talking about them. I know Pathfinder does. Pathfinder devotes a lot of time to what they call exploration mode, which is that freer time in between fights. And they even put a fair amount of thought into downtime mode. What can your players be doing in between sessions? And we could spend a lot of time talking about that, but that's not so much a story writing thing as a game mastering thing. So we're going to leave that. But I don't know what's your experience, in recent games. How important are exploration and downtime as opposed to just combat games?
I think having the time for players to be able to go and buy stuff with their gold, go and be able to have player downtime and engagement and see culture within your world. If you've spent time building that out, and even if you want to build that out, I think the key thing to remember is a GM is responsible for control and consequence, mainly. The story plot is something actually you can map out together as players, in the sense of you're telling a story together as you go through. So I think having agency where they can go and spend their gold, they can be immersed and see, the king they just pushed off the mountain. Actually, there are ramifications. You now cannot go to that city. You will be murdered and beheaded and raped and everything else in between. So it is really important, I think, to have that agency and be able to have downtime in between the big battles, big epic scenes, that you can obviously make use of the rewards that have been given.
Yeah. Also, with that, take your analogy of killing the king. Well, they're going to want revenge, and they're going to send someone after you. So that nice little safe town that you had, well, that's not so safe anymore.
Jemma? Any thought?
Look, in terms of how I try to do that, is I try to put interesting NPCs in front of the characters that will give them the hint about what threads they might want to pull on, without necessarily saying, go here, do the thing. I think the days where GMs can get away with that, kind of sadly in the past. It was nice while it lasted, but not so much now. I think the trick is to give them, to lead them to the place you want to go, and make it feel for them like it's their idea that they've gone there.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I was just going to quickly say that can be a bit of an arcane art, and it requires a bit of a meta level of GM craft and understanding to be able to do that. And likewise, as a writer of that sort of content, to be able to present that content in a way that pulls the character forwards in the direction you want to go, rather than shoving him from behind. Although shoving him from behind can also be another valid way to deal with it. A dragon's just raided the village. You're level 1. Run away!
Yeah. I want to just mention something that builds on something both Jemma said and Games said. Games, you mentioned immersion, and Jemma, you mentioned interesting NPCs. One of the things I try to do when I populate a village, and we were talking about, a place to spend your gold. All right, you can have somebody walk into a shop and, I want to buy a 50-foot coil of rope. Okay, fine. The general store's over there. You walk into the general store. The shopkeeper says it costs 5 copper or whatever it is. You buy your rope and you walk out. Or the shopkeeper of the general store might be kind of harried today because his wife has gone off to visit some aunt or something, and he's got the 3 little kids running around the shop tearing stuff apart while they're in the shop, and he's really kind of distracted. And maybe now is a good time to get a good deal from him because he's too busy, or maybe he got yelled at by his wife this morning and he's in a really foul mood, and no, he's not bargaining at all today. There's you can take something as simple as a shopkeeper, and with a sentence or two, and no more than that, give them a backstory that puts some flavor and real life into the whole. I walk into a shop to buy a piece of rope.
Give the NPC actually a personality.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not, I want to buy this, fine, go.
Right. Yeah.
When you go into any shop,
you don't need to write 3 pages on him. You don't need to know his life, his family history for the last 4 generations. All right, like I said, a sentence or two. What happened to him this morning? What kind of mood is she in now, and why? And use that to flavor that little interaction, and that's all it's ever going to be. So. And
even if there's a particular, maybe even a quirk to the shopkeeper, i.e., they have a wooden leg, or they have a cat named Molly, and as you walk in, the cat walks through your legs, and he says, "Oh, Molly, come on, get away." That just adds just a silly little thing to a scene, but adds so much more immersion to the world.
And devious tip number 1 for everybody in the audience: if you're not doing that now, and you start doing it, you'd be surprised how many times your players are going to think, "Oh my God, that cat's important," because he wouldn't have mentioned it otherwise.
We'll spend the next 2 hours talking about the cat.
Yes, I was about to say that that can be a cautionary tale in its own right.
Yeah.
Though.
Yes.
Because sometimes they will. As an example, I've played quite a lot of and run quite a lot of sci-fi RPGs. And one of the ones I've run quite extensively is Star Trek Adventures. And I had a large AI system that went into a space station that was made up of lots of other machines, and then all of those closed up around the core intelligence, the core computing substrate, and the players. And this actually led to the campaign kind of falling apart. The players wanted to dig into the actual content of the station. They wanted to board it. It's like, no. It's just packed lots of other micro machines that have kind of pulled themselves apart to let the thing in and then closed up around it. There is no station per se. It's just a bunch of matter that's gone and glued itself to the side of this thing. But we want to look for a door. There's no door. But we want to look for
I've also had that, yeah.
I want to spend momentum to go and actually see if there is a door, and I expect you to tell me that there is a door if I roll well enough on my roll. It's like, really?
Or they start going off and buying explosives to make a door.
Yeah, exactly.
Quite often I've actually been given... Some of my more, I think, sadistic trap and ideas have come from players going, what if the GM is thinking this, and what if he's doing this? I'm like, oh, that's a good idea. Yeah. Why didn't I do that?
Yeah.
So, note to audience: always be careful what you say in front of the GM.
Yes,
always listening.
I mean, that example I gave, the actual purpose from my perspective as a GM and as a writer of that content was to actually armor the vulnerable AI substrate, give it something that could resist a potential combat scenario which was coming up, and then and also be a bit more powered up so it could defend itself. So the players kind of took the whole situation in a different direction, and yeah, was tired and I was having a bad day, and that unfortunately didn't work out well. But these things happen.
All right. So we're talking about, quote unquote exploration mode, and even a little bit of downtime, and how you can actually put a little flavor into it. That's not the only, going shopping isn't the only exploration activity we can do too. And in fact, I think there's a lot of overlap. Combat is an easy one. Everybody understands what combat is. Everybody knows what happens when somebody says roll for initiative.
I hit it.
It just.
How do you hit it? No, I hit it.
But there are other encounters that you can build into your games. Other kinds of encounters too. For example, social interactions. We've been talking about them kind of in an exploration mode method here, but social interactions can become encounters as well. I mean, if you're talking to the shopkeeper about what flavor cheese you want to buy, that's one thing. If you're talking to the palace guard about why he really needs to let you in when he's under orders not to let anyone in, that could be a little more important to the whole story arc, and may involve the use of skills or abilities or whatever from the players in order to get past that guard, either by talking him through, or sneaking past him, or some combination of both, or holding his attention long enough to knock him out.
And I think that's exactly it, because I use a system where I go social engagement, and I may have engagement, and if I've done that, I will then have a social, where you engage with them, and engagement doesn't have to be you are surrounded by orcs. Combat. It can be you're walking through a cave and you trigger a trap. I actually had a trap which was kind of stolen from Star Trek, where it was like a hollow, when they put the prism around them and they can't get out, and it's like a force field. I had that where actually in the force field there was a man doing shapes with hand movements. If they copied the hand movements, it undid the trap, but it's then working out how to get out of the trap.
Well, traps is actually a whole other area I was gonna bring up as encounters, traps and puzzles.
Before we jump into that, we do have a question on deck.
Okay.
Which is kind of.
I was hoping somebody was keeping track of questions, because
I've done. Basically, I just wanted to put this question out there because it's more related to what we've been talking on. How do you balance the players who are happily shopping, doing downtime crafts, etc., with the players who want to be doing something in a sort of minor solo happenstance of some sort?
Well,
interesting.
Hopefully you have a feel for which types of players you've got in the first place. Hopefully. Now, that's not always going to happen, and even if you think that player A is happy to spend time shopping today, they might want to be, they might be ready to kill something because something bad happened to them in real life 2 hours ago.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, basically, you just have to go with it. I mean, if they're walking into a shop and they're having fun with the fact that you're playing up the interaction, go with it for a while. Just kind of flow with it. If they're acting kind of dismissive of the whole thing, yeah, fine, just give me my rope. That kind of gives you the hint. And certain players, yeah, you might know that, when this person goes to buy something, they're not going to waste time. This person is going to waste time. Hopefully, and I know part of the question is, how do you balance it across the whole table? How do you keep the one who wants to go kill something from being bored because the other three are having fun in the bakery, picking out which cupcake flavor they want, Yeah, sometimes it's hard. I mean, To be honest, I'm not sure if there's any. I don't think there's any hard and fast way, other than being aware of the issue, and using that to just kind of speed up the interaction a little bit. So instead of drawing it out, if everybody's having fun with it, though, hell, go with it for a while. Pretty
much.
I think it's also remembering the balance between the two is. You need interactions and you need to be able to have combat and things like that. And there's no reason why actually you can't have both. I.e., they are shopping and they discover something that is going on, i.e., a thief walks in and steals something. That itself can be an engagement. It's still a social interaction. They're still buying their gold. They're still getting their bits and bobs. But if they're spending 20 minutes working out what colour paint they want to buy to be put on their shield with the blacksmith. That's when you can start throwing in what I kind of call GM curveballs of you're in the general store. The door slowly creeps open. You see eyes just peering in, looking to see where you assume the shopkeeper is. All of a sudden, the door bursts open. You see a man run in, grab something off the counter, and run out, and the shopkeeper screaming after them. You can kind of keep a engagement going. You don't necessarily have to be, as I say, a combat and roll for initiative. There doesn't have to always be that action. You have multiple engagements that you can undertake.
Yeah, and another tool that you can have handy would and this kind of goes toward a reward system almost. Especially if you have one player who consistently thinks it's a waste of time to do shopping trips, let's say. If you're in the habit of providing a minor, and I would never do this with a major piece of information, but any kind of like minor tidbit of clue or hint or help, that only comes out if you're actually friendly and engaging with the shopkeeper. Like the shop, if you walk into the store and say, I want a rope, how much is it? And he says 5 copper, and you say, here's the copper, give me the rope. He's not, the shopkeeper's not going to say, oh, by the way, you should go to the shop 3 doors down and see what's going on down there. But if you engage that shopkeeper in a general conversation, how's it going today? What's going on? Oh, I see your kids are running around. Blah, blah, blah. Now, just as two humans, that shopkeeper is likely to talk about other things, and maybe one of those, and if one of those other things is something that helps them in whatever endeavor they're in, all right, after you've done that 2 or 3 times, they're going to want to talk to the shopkeepers. Even that person who generally didn't think it was, who thought it was a waste of time, is going to realize that it isn't a waste of time. All right, so, again, you don't want to do it anything major, because if they don't do it, you don't want them to, you don't want the adventure to fail if they don't engage the right shopkeeper. But provide little bonus tips, just kind of keep them on the side, and again, only dish them out if they engage.
I have been known to write up tables when I'm writing an adventure. If they speak to people in town or wherever they are, they can roll on this table and they get this piece of information, or this other person gives them this piece of information. They have to visit. They actually have to go speak to these people to be able to get that.
Right, and hopefully there are things that they can get by without. Again, these none of this should be showstopper information.
No.
But
it could crop up later.
But if they think it's helpful, and it might even be stuff that you've already reinforced somewhere else. If they hear it, all of a sudden they hear the same rumor from 4 different people. You haven't given them any new information, but you've reinforced the information you've given them. And as players, they're going to consider that important. So.
Or they walk past people talking, and they overhear them say X, Y, Z, whatever.
Yeah.
They have to actually go to that part and walk past these people that are talking to get that information. If they're just hurrying around town, not paying attention, well, they don't get that information.
Yeah. One thing I would quickly add is there can be a difference between side quests and main quest sequences, or in terms of how subtle you are with those sorts of things. So if you've got an optional side quest that might actually require digging into the state of mind of a shopkeeper or a person you pass on the side of the road who looks a little nervous, that might be very different to, that would be a very different level of optionality, I guess, than having a main quest sequence where you might make it so that regardless of where in town your party is, after a certain amount of time, they will be found by a courier with a note from a major NPC saying, please come and meet me, I have a piece of work that requires urgent attention. And you guys are adventurers, I hear you're pretty good, your reputation precedes you, ... Nothing like a compliment to actually get people engaged as well,
Nothing like a bit of bribery as well.
I can tell you, one of my player groups would immediately follow that with, how did you find me? How did you know I was here? Who's spying on me?
Oh, we've been going door to door looking for you all day. We found you at this pub, sure. But the pub was about the third place we tried. We didn't find you in the bakery. We didn't find you at the general store, Oh, you're in the pub? Nice. Okay.
What a surprise, yeah.
Another one I've done before is I was running the Essentials kit, Dragon Rice Fire Peak campaign, and the blacksmith in town kept complaining that I can't get you this item because I've not got the materials, I'm running low because my delivery didn't arrive. Well, if they'd actually bothered to follow that up, they'd have found a side mission where the caravan had been attacked.
Yeah.
But unfortunately never did. So they got stuck with limited equipment.
That'll teach them.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on a little bit. Sticking to the concept of writing adventures, though, there's two main categories or areas, I think, where we can talk about writing adventures that are popular everywhere, and that is, are you writing an adventure for an existing world? A published environment. Forgotten Realms for D&D, Galarian for Pathfinder, anything in the Star Wars Empire, pretty much. Are you playing within a realm where there is canon lore, or are you writing for something that you're brewing up yourself? Before we get into the brewing up yourself, which introduces a whole extra level of of building and writing, has anybody gotten of this group? Do we have any experience of people writing for a canned environment?
I've done a little bit, more to add, especially the Dragon Rice Fire Peak module. I didn't just go by the book. I added in little bits. I added in a Dragonborn paladin character who was kind of the town leader kind of figure, with a noble. So and he was the rival of the person that ran the mine, who was a bit corrupt. Obviously, the Dragonborn paladin, always lawful good, following, obviously, very moral, and you get this corrupt mine owner. Unfortunately, it never went down that track, but it was all there.
But what are the challenges, though, to writing into an existing canon?
Yeah.
Making it fit, mainly.
That's definitely a strong part of it. I actually wrote an outline for a Dungeons and Dragons Adventurers League convention module, which actually ended up getting written by other people, but only because I was having a bit of a cognitive crash at the time, and I said, look, develop it, figure it out. But that was an interesting piece, but having to match the lore, as Stretch said, to the Forbidden Lands setting was a bit of a challenge in its own right. What was the bigger challenge, though, is that D&D for Adventurers League, or Wizards of the Coast for Adventurers League, they have very specific requirements around pacing, around the mechanical components of the adventure. So there should be a balance of at least 2 of the 3 D&D adventure elements of, you mentioned them before, exploration, social interaction, and combat. There was a lot of quality control hoops to jump through, and I think I got there with the outline. Like, it was a pretty detailed outline, but putting the dotting the I's and crossing the T's would have actually taken quite a bit of effort, just in terms of making sure that it fit all of the AL requirements for a convention-ready module.
Yeah, I think that the problem you have to worry about most if you're doing that is, especially if your players are very well versed in that setting's lore. All right, you don't get you can create characters within it, but those characters have to behave like the lore says they behave. You can't, because if you don't do that, you end up with fights around the table. Drow elves can't do that. Or that sort of person wouldn't have come. You said this person came from such and such a city. Why don't they look and act like this instead of like that? Because so if you're gonna write to an existing, and the more popular the canned environment is, the harder this is. You better be well versed in the lore yourself.
I think fan fiction is always quite difficult. I think is where this comes in.
Same reason.
Writing in somebody else's world.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something I would particularly want to do, I think, to be honest. Just because you're then limited on the creative freedoms you have, right? It's not your baby. But to the other flip side of that, if it is already a mature world, you have something that you can build on rather than start from scratch, which can be easier to some people, especially starting out. So I think it's there's a mix between the two.
Yeah, if all you're doing, you mentioned starting out, that's a good point. If you're really just concerned about creating an adventure track, and you don't want to have to worry about, how do these things behave? How do these things, where did they come from? Where do they live? What does the terrain look like? Then a canned environment is perfect, because the world is built for you. But the downside or the flip side to that is, yes, now you have to live within that world. You have to use creatures from that world. You have to use, settings from that world. You can't put a new city. You might be able to put a new village between Waterdeep and Candlekeep, but you can't put a new city between Waterdeep and Candlekeep.
Yeah.
Because you're going to end up with a 20-minute argument about why that city shouldn't exist. And if you are going to deviate from canon, now you need to have a really, really, really solid reason for why that's okay. So that just a little bit of advice or tidbit for that. It's the fastest way to get an adventure going. If you're just starting out as a GM and you just want to try your hand at stringing together, encounters, it's a good way to go. But know the setting that you're working in, and be prepared to live with it, I think.
One thing I would just quickly mention on Forbidden Lands, I actually found that it didn't have enough information on some stuff. Like even in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, all that sort of extra content they'd actually put into Forbidden Lands, it just didn't have answers that I could answer. So that was a challenge to be able to actually create content that acknowledged what was in there, but also what had its own setup, its own concepts.
It's true it is an interesting environment, because let's face it, the environment was built. Yeah, the canon came from several series of novels, and those novels took place in very specific places with very specific people. So those places and people are very, very, very well detailed and thought out. All right. There are other places, though, that were nothing more than a mention or a village that got passed through, or, I needed something to put on the map because this spot of the map looked empty. They're still there. They're part of the canon. But, yeah, if, you might find yourself having to figure out, well, who is supposed to live in this village? Because the wiki doesn't tell me.
To me, not having that kind of information is like a playground. Lovely.
It can be, but you know what though? That might also be something that you do a session 0 talk about.
Yeah.
I want to have this happen in the village of Burgerville, which is between these two cities, on the Sword Coast. You pick, all right, there's a little dot on the map and it has a name, but there's absolutely no background information for it. Talk to the players about who should be living there. Who's in the region, what, mainly just to prevent surprise, so that you don't on session 1 have people saying, well, wait, why is this a dwarven city?
Yeah. Also get some more immersed in your world.
Right. Yes.
Or the setting, because they feel like they've created part of it.
Yeah.
The first ever campaign I ran, the players had to leave the village because of an attack. And they said, right, go through the forest. So they wanted to know what was in the forest. So rather than just tell them, I turned to the player that was playing the ranger and say, so okay, leave it to you. What kind of animals can you expect in the forest? Mm-hmm. It was his domain, being the loner ranger that we were playing. So it was well, I'll leave it down to you.
Definitely. I think that's where, as I said earlier, the story is to be told between the GM and the party. The GM is responsible for consequences, control, and ultimately outcome. But so control in terms of ensuring everyone has fair and equitable use of the rules, ensuring that everyone has a opportunity to have their input, and you go around the table and go, right, Bob, your turn, Jemma, your turn, so, etc. So that you each one gets their turn, and then the story, i.e., especially if they go off the beaten path, which is never a good idea, as we will be seeing in, I think, one of the maps that Bob and Leo have made. Walking off the beaten path, I think, is in your game coming up. Absolute suicide, by the sounds of it.
The one that I'm creating the monsters for.
Well, no, we have to beat them back onto the path. Let's put it.
Yeah.
But if they refuse, you kill them. Yes.
Yeah. There is a big sign saying, "You really don't want to go this way."
So anyway, moving on to the next, the broader and easier for the GM, but a lot more work for the GM is writing adventures in a homebrew world. All right, and it's easier obviously because because the only lore you have to match is your own. All right.
Definitely.
But I think the first important thing is to remember is, although you get to make up the lore, you need to make up the lore, and you still need to be consistent once you have. You can't have magic work one way in this village and a different way in the next village, unless you spend some time explaining why.
If you, within your meta and everything, have set up that magic works on meridian lines, and certain places on different parts of the line have different magical abilities or magical strengths, or certain cities align to the temple that's in the city, and the temple denotes the power which can be used there, i.e. if it's a light temple, dark magic will not work in that city. If it's a water temple, then fire magic would not work in that city. But the point is, you have to be able to explain it and not constantly change it, because otherwise your players will go, right, I've worked out in your world this is how this works, and if you haven't, they assume magic is the same as every magic system, and when they magically find out it's not, that's when people start getting grumpy.
Yeah. Has anybody else had experience with changing the common expectations in a homebrew world? If you know.
I have. Sorry, go. My Dalmoria world was intentionally built to counter tropes and cliches. Also, to me, magic became a bit of a utility in classic D&D. It was used, to me, a little bit too much. So in my world, magic, while mechanically the same, isn't used as much. Magic casters are about as rare as the Jedi in The New Hope, Star Wars. And it's, rather than elf lands, dwarf lands, human lands, and all things like that, they're all intermingled. And it's country and nation over race.
Jemma,
Yeah, I've created a world called Cottaset, which I've run people through the starter campaign for a few times. I know I've gotten up to as far as about 10th level. I am continually nudging at the edges of what worked and what didn't work in the previous run-throughs of that particular campaign with different groups. One of the things I really like about that setting, though, was the fact that I could actually control the overall structures of the societies. Like, I could actually put in a bit more nuance into a number of different things. I could include some of the social ideals that I have myself around the different kinds of motivations I want governments to have. So the halfling race in this particular world was, I guess you'd call them a sort of anarcho-syndicalist group that had very much anarchic views around various things. You also had a very benevolent despotism built around a monarchy, which had a council of dragons sitting behind it, but good dragons. So, very benign in their outlook, but also very Machiavellian in terms of how they chose to pull and target the threads of human lives and manipulate the world to try and achieve their own objectives, which were largely, let's keep the humans happy, but also let's not have huge wasteful wars, let's not have huge amounts of lives lost to dumb shit, basically. But there was also darkness in that world, and balancing that with creating new characters and NPCs between each iteration of the world actually gave me an opportunity to actually humanize the darker elements. Like, there was way down near the polar regions, there was a group of orc and half-orc slave traders who had an economic empire built on slavery. So it was quite interesting to actually see how players engaged with that, because that was the background. If they did a level 0 character start, they would actually get run through it was basically built a small campaign for new players to learn the basics of D&D. So it was a lot more on rails than other things, but it gave them an opportunity to learn their classes, learn how to use their characters' capabilities and so on in a way which didn't have all the baggage of of an actual class baked around them.
Yeah, you can. I know one experience of mine, the world that I'm building now, my Criterion world. I've played some rather fast and loose games with Fey races. As far as what the books say they're supposed to be like, and I find myself you have to be consistent, and that sometimes means you have to do a little more work than you'd even thought. In my world, for example, the various Fey creatures, sprites and pixies and dryads and the whole range were created. At some point, some of them, of each of the species, were corrupted by other gods. Right? And that's where the gremlins come from. So in my world, every gremlin was something else at some point in its past life. But what does that mean? That means every time I want to introduce a new, as the players are moving up in level and I'm coming up with better things for them, I have to remember now, okay, well, I'm going to throw this gremlin out, and what was this gremlin before? Because I need to know that, because they're going to ask that, because they're getting into that whole thing, to that whole piece of the lore. The other big Fey deep departure I went for, and I'm still, after 6 months, I still have to remind the one guy that's playing a gnome in one of my playgroups, is that gnomes are not Fey in my world. All right. Gnomes are the result of the elf god, one of the elf gods and one of the dwarf gods getting together after those two races were created and deciding amongst themselves, you know what, we could do better. So they built something that was kind of in between. And that's because I always thought gnomes were more dwarf-like than elf-like. I always wondered why they were in the Fey group, So in my world, they're not. Now, that gives me another limitation that's worth mentioning. Is if you're messing around with a player race, but you're using an established rule set, you need to figure out a way to reconcile what you've done to it to what the rule book says I should be able to build as a character. So if you look for, I'm using Pathfinder 2nd edition, for example. If you look at all of the different heritages that a gnome can have, 3 of them mention, 3 of them are related to the fact that they're first world creatures. I have to come up with new descriptions for those heritages that still give the same attributes, because the player is expecting the stats.
Yeah. Very much so.
But now I have to, but now instead of you can do this because you're first world, now it's you can do this because of something else. Mm-hmm. So, even in a completely homebrew world, you're limited, or you're going to be governed by the game system that you're playing in to some extent.
If you're playing D&D, you can't say your elves are, now 50-foot giants, right?
Right.
There are set scripts. I think I just want to take us slightly down that avenue a little bit and off the beaten track. Is there's obviously resources out there for adventure writing. Is there any ones that you guys can think of? I know Because homebrew, when we look at these items, are very different to that of using resources to support the development or the running of pre-written material. So what do you guys think in that area?
Obviously, we're going to say World Anvil is fantastic for it. But I've found for only 5e, D&D Beyond has pretty good homebrew calculators and things like that. But that is very much for the set published stuff. But it's still pretty decent. As far as other game sets go, I don't know if anyone else has any ideas.
I can tell you that Wizards of the Coast publishes a D&D Adventurers League style guide and a lot of content templates for writing adventures, which can be helpful. There are also quite a number of resources on Drive-Through RPG, which cover all sorts of content preparation and style guide type stuff. DM's Guild is the sort of official sub-site of Drive-Through RPG for D&D Adventurers League content and D&D content in general. So definitely worth checking some of that out.
Yeah, I forgot about the DM Guild. That is such a good catch. I forgot about that completely. That wasn't even in my brain.
Also, just thought about two things. There's Cobalt Press and Raging Swan Press. Both absolutely fantastic.
Excellent material that you can put into multiple systems, yeah.
Yeah.
Paizo, by the way, has the Pathfinder Society, which is kind of parallel to the the Wizards of the Coast official. They also publish style guides, and you can create they'll sanction adventure modules or whatever if you build them to their style and all that sort of thing. And I think Pathfinder Society actually covers not only the first and second edition Pathfinders but Starfinder as well.
I believe so.
That by the way, that's an interesting mix. Pathfinder has a very interesting. They have this distinct, Starfinder and Pathfinder. They're really based on the same system. So I know there are a lot of people out there that Sable being one of them that Sable and Erin claim that they're building, that they're playing Pathfinder, but they're playing Pathfinder in space. That's Starfinder. So, there might be elements. The point is, though, there might be elements from other similar games that you could bring into your homebrew. You just have to make sure that the mechanics either already match or that you can make whatever adjustments you need to make them match. It would be very difficult, playing in both worlds. It would be very difficult to take a Star Wars Edge of Empire Millennium Falcon and drop it into the Forgotten Realms.
Yeah.
Simply not just from a believability standpoint, but from a game mechanic standpoint. The whole set of statistics that get built in the Star Wars Edge of Empire world are nothing like the statistics for a vehicle. That you would worry about in Forgotten Realms, in D&D. So, it's not as simple. You get no benefit from the from the import.
Yep. Before we move on much further, we do have a question from chat at the moment. In your homebrew, how do you provide a variety or limit the player races available to players without letting them feel making them feel boxed into a particular choice?
Well, all right, I'll start real quick. In Carterian, there are 12 base player races right now. I am planning on adding a couple of other. I have some ideas for the hybrids. which might actually open up technically whatever the math says, any combination of any 2 out of 12, however many combinations that is, which would probably somewhere in the hundreds, I think. But I haven't done anything with that yet. But just those 12, it's in that system though. It's not just 12. It's not just the 12 races, because each race has a subculture. All right, and in my world, the default 4 or 5 that Pathfinder does, I've expanded to 7. So although I might be limited to what seems like 12 races, in reality, I'm starting off with 84 options. I mean, they don't all look different. It's not 84 completely unique species, but there's 84 starting points. All right. By the time you finish throwing into that, then okay, and what did you do for a living? And whatever. I mean, there are hundreds. Right? And D&D 5th has the same kind of choices. All right. Even if you stuck with the original 5 or 6 races, the traditional human, halfling, dwarf, elf, whoever else you throw into that. I know. What else would be? Human, halfling, dwarf, elf. Who am I forgetting?
Wizard, mage.
Those are the original 4, probably. I mean, if you go back to my history.
Yeah, barbarian.
Back when dwarf and elf were classes and weren't even races.
From experience, also, most players don't want to play something stupidly obscure anyway, because it actually makes their life hard as well.
Actually, I don't know. It's amazing how many people want to play tieflings.
I love tieflings.
I wouldn't say they're obscure,
though. Oh, by the way, speaking of which, in Carterian, tiefling and Aesir are really just 2 different aspects of the same thing, and this is going to be one of my next add-on races. I have a wide variety of deities. Each race has a mini pantheon, and within those pantheons there are good and evil. All right, and rather than having a separate race for touched by a demon, or demon parentage or angel parentage, I'm basically just going to have one for deific parentage. And if that one, and you're going to pick up aspects from from whatever your deity parent happened to be, or grandparent or whatever. So you might have horns, you might have wings. You might be good and have horns. You might be bad and have wings.
Yeah. So half planars rather than.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And just have that as one. And this is that would be a situation where I basically only have to define one player race. Half planar or whatever I call it. But it alone provides a huge number of sub choices.
Yeah, definitely.
Again, I was thinking the same thing for hybrids. I haven't fully worked this one out, but if all of these races, and especially nowadays when we're trying to reinforce equality and everything else in all things everywhere, if my 12 base races, which are everything from humans to bird folk to rat folk and cat folk and lizard folk, if they're all equivalent, then and we don't want to call them different species, then why can't Mr. Lizard and Mrs. Rat have a kid? And what would Mr. Lizard and Mrs. Rat's kid look like? And act like? So I'm tempted. I'm very, very much leaning toward opening up hybrid as a as a player race, shall we say, but pick your 2 parents. There's 144 more choices. So
and then you throw the chronic sorcerer in the mix. Then it gets interesting.
Yeah,
it's actually a challenge. It's a challenge to trying to design an environment when I started building Carterian, Pathfinder 2nd Edition had just come out. There were 6 races. Yeah. So I said, cool. All I have to worry about is 6 races, and I just have to make my adjustments to 6 races. I wasn't a mile down the road, and the core player's guide came out, and here's 6 more races. Yeah. So
enjoy.
And then some of the other supplements started coming out, and why? And unfortunately, why? It's because the Pathfinder people were saying something like, wait, we don't have a Dragonborn. D&D has a Dragonborn. We want a Dragonborn. Or we want a construct player race, or whatever, because the other guys have it. Mm-hmm. So, so what do I do? I mean, will I get to them if people insist on it eventually? Yes. Am I going to kill myself, from day one? No.
I want a Goliath race. It's one of my favourite.
Yeah, well, in the lore for D&D, Goliaths are basically half giants, so there's no reason why you couldn't just, using the same logic as your hybrids, have a half storm giant, a half stone giant, half.
Yeah, I actually toyed with having giant or as a giant kin as one of the player races. Mm-hmm. But the problem was, to me anyway, being an engineer by education and therefore a bit of a math and sciencey kind of nerd, and as well as a fantasy nerd, and I couldn't figure out how to justify toning the stats down for a level 1 character, from a giant without just turning them into a human or an orc. Structurally. Yeah, they would look different. They would have different parentage. But what's the difference? What makes them unique statistic-wise? And there wasn't anything. And how do you justify? Why would we call it a giant if it's only 6.5 foot tall and only weighs a little bit more than a human? That's just.
And by nature, if they are 12 foot tall, they are going to be slightly stronger.
Right, exactly. Now there is some range in the Pathfinder style system to give them a strength boost at the beginning, but orcs, for example, have a strength boost at the beginning. I can't give them any more of a boost than orcs get.
No,
so
5e. Sorry, go.
No, I was going to say I can't. There were limits already established by the rule set to what I could do to define them.
And that's where you be an absolute rebel and break all the rules.
Well, yeah, but then you run into problems of the system breaking. And,
true.
And
then you just write your own system, and then you go down a completely different avenue of hell.
Which we might get to before the end of this talk, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's something that I'm currently working on. I actually have a sci-fi adventure that's based on the player race is basically a hexapod reptilian sapient species that are vaguely centaur-like in the sense that they are an arboreal race, but they can get around on all fours on the ground or stand upright on 2 and move a bit more slowly. But in trees, they tend to use all 6 of their limbs, their bottom 4 limbs for climbing rather than for galloping along the ground, which is a very different mechanical kind of setup. And I have 2 different paths that campaign can take. You can either run it as a terrestrial resistance campaign where a slaver race has kind of invaded their world and they've come out of their bunkers several hundred years after that invasion is kind of set up. And the other one is a space opera thing where a bunch of those the Zassa, a bunch of Zas, actually took off into space looking for allies and actually finally come across them about 800 years later. So, you know, and that's actually been really interesting because I've actually had to dig into the anatomy and biophysics and physiology of the Zasar in a way to make them feasible from a, you know, because you know you're going to have your rules lawyers who are going to say, but the hexapods, aren't they going to have this particular structure and this particular way of doing things and all that sort of thing. So I've had to be quite thorough in actually dealing with all of the limitations and the design of the actual race itself, which for humanoid races is actually something you don't have to do quite so much because there's such a basic common template that you're working from there.
Actually, you made me start to think about adding centaurs as a player race.
Yeah,
just traditional, even just traditional centaurs. I don't know that any of the other games. I mean, every one of the traditional big fantasy RPGs has centaurs as creatures. Yeah. But do they ever come in as? I mean, and you can have individual NPCs that are centaurs, but I don't know that I've ever seen a centaur player race.
Yeah,
I don't know. I must say that does make me think around, you know, alternative creatures and races around, you know, how interested would it be to have a spider race which you could play as, like Aragog, for example, out of Harry Potter.
Also, I was in a 5e one-shot, and one of the players was a centaur, which was interesting.
Yeah, it could be. Like I said, I think that would be an easy add because I mean they're gonna run a little faster. Again, they're gonna be a little stronger, but no stronger than an orc. They're gonna be a little, you know, they'll be lacking someplace else or whatever. But from a balance standpoint, I could see myself designing a level 1 centaur.
They're gonna have problem climbing, as we found out.
Well, that's something that they can't do. Yeah, but their trade-off for that is they can run twice as fast as anything else. You know, on flat ground. You know.
Yeah.
Also, go on.
I was just going to quickly add, if you were going to homebrew a centaur race, you could actually look at other types of four-limbed, other forms of hexapods that are based on other types of creatures like cattle. You could actually have a bovine centaur type template. Right. You could have
actually, I have seen Minotaur player characters. I mean,
but they're more based on the hominid.
That's true. Yeah, physiological.
Yeah. Whereas, but you know, like deer or moose, or you know, there'd be any number of other different races that you could make some sort of variation on the centaur.
Right.
Work with.
Yeah. Good point. But like I said, those would definitely be believable. You know, the funny thing is, I'm thinking you mentioned, for example, they can't climb. An inclination would be to give them a major dex penalty for not only climbing, but, you know, balancing on narrow ledges or whatever, you know.
Whereas for spiders, you could do the complete opposite, right?
Right, but at the same time, you'd have to, again, and this is where game system comes in, you can't just give them a blanket dex penalty because the odds are that bow and arrow is one of their most popular weapons. And that needs dex to use. So you're not going to penalize them with their preferred weapon. So you have to be a little creative with some of the more exotic species, but I think they're doable.
Also, snake people.
I'll have to look for that one. Yeah.
In one of my worlds, I think it's my Dalmoria world, I have basically vampiric elves that are top body female humanoid and snake lower body.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep. That's UNT in the D&D.
Yeah, I made mine slightly different though.
Yeah.
There is the UNT, and there's another one as well. I can't remember the name of it. And also, chat are going on about hyper-intelligent species of spider. So basically, spider people. Look, we've already mentioned Drider. I know it's in Pathfinder, it's the Drider. 5e, I can't remember.
I think it might also be a Drider or something functionally similar.
Yeah, because didn't Drider come from the Drow elves?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
It's a Drow elf mixed with a spider.
But that was done before the 3.5 Wizards Paizo split. So both of them got it.
So there's the Naga. Thank you, Dragon Magpie. Naga.
Yeah. That was So
I'm trying to think of. Also, there's the elemental races, Genasi, things like that.
Yeah, for sure. I'd also kind of mention that even though I haven't actually developed them as player character races yet, there are other races in that sci-fi setting that I was talking about, and several of them will appear in both settings. One as an enslaved version, the other as a freed version. Where the enslaved versions are fulfilling specific roles within the overseer race's agenda in terms of duties and roles. So there's a bird species that are called Jackthorn. Oh no, sorry. The arachnid type race is called the Jackthorn. There's a bird-like species race. I can't remember what I called them. And there's also a sort of bear-like creature with spade-like hands that evolved as farmers, and they became traders because they were actually producing excess material, and looked into all the sociology and anthropology and the economics of how those races interacted with each other in terms of how I constructed them, and again same sort of weird physiology mixes that are pretty unique to this system. And I've actually got an SRD which I'm looking to build that system around. If anyone wants to take a look at that, that's at RPG Drive-Thru RPG, which has a copy of it, and that'll always be free. And I'm basically trying to write settings for it in terms of the World Anvil content that I'm creating. But eventually I want to start releasing guides for the specific settings that implement that rule set in much the same way as GURPS did a similar sort of thing.
Yes, that's kind of the model that I'm hoping for too. We've been bouncing around an important aspect of home brewing here. We've been talking about player races, in this regard, but it applies to other things in homebrew too. When you're building your own world, you have a lot of freedom as to who or what lives there, not only as player races, but also as the critters that are going to be on the other side of the encounter. And yes, DM's smiling already. But the important thing that you have to remember here is you still don't have carte blanche per se. You're going to be playing in a game system. All right, so you need to keep that game system in mind. It's especially important with player characters or player character options, because you don't want to create something that's either severely underpowered or overpowered, because they're not going to be fun to play. I mean, well, the overpowered might be fun to play for the person who's playing it, but it won't be for the rest of the party. The underpowered one isn't going to be fun. So you have to actually pay attention to your game mechanics, the mechanics of your game system when you start creating your own content, especially creatures. I mean, it's easy to create villages, and geography and that sort of thing. But if anything that you're going to create that actually interacts with your players or the players themselves, you need to be very conscious of the mechanics, and you need to spend some time, and this is my tip here, look at the existing ones and look at the range. So if you want to create a new race, look at the ones that are available now and look at how they balanced. Well, if this one has got more strength, what did they take away? And so forth. Because you can't just create a race that's that's stronger, more dexterous, more durable, smarter, wiser, and better looking. All right. If you do that, then nobody's going to want to play any of the others.
Just you describing us there, Bob?
Well, yeah. There need to be penalties. Yeah. And if you're going to give them a special ability, they get this magic spell, as an innate spell. There needs to be a penalty to offset that. All right. So you need to think about that, and the best way to think about it is to look at what's available. I mean, use the fact that D&D 5th edition and Paizo and Pathfinder have been play tested to death, and they've been tweaked. And errata have come out that have made adjustments based on that play testing, and even based on the first year of live experience. All right, build on that. Use that. All right, so use what's out there as a guide for you when you want to build something on the side of it. Because if what you build on the side of it is very, very different, the odds are in the long run it's not going to work. It's going to break something. If it's not broken itself, it's going to break something along the way. That said, we can also talk about not only player races, but creating interesting things for your players to come across. All right, the probably the most obvious and most fun place, if you're creating a whole new world, you get to populate it. All right, and that means you can come up with your own unique hybrids, horrors. And I'm going to ask DMStretch, how do you come up with your ideas for interesting, unique critters?
I take inspiration either from other games, other media, even real life. In my Ravnica world, I made this horrific fungus that ejects spores, and it's called the Last Breath Pod. That is literally taken from real life. It's called the zombie ant fungus, which it infects an ant. Spore grows inside the ant's head, and it's nasty. And I just tweak. I take little bits from here. There's no such thing as an original idea anymore. It's all been done. So it's all right. I may take a little bit from Skyrim, but I'll add this bit from real life. I'll add this bit from, say, Pathfinder, and bring it into D&D. Things like that. And then just make it your own.
I agree. I think... But by doing that, you do create somewhat an original idea. Obviously, you use inspirations, but from that you derive something original, something new, which wasn't there previously, which I think is really exciting. I think one of the huge benefits when writing RPG between homebrew and fan fiction or pre-written content between the two.
Yeah.
This from our master of copyright law, by the way. So.
There's such a thing as, what's the term? Derivative works that are not necessarily a straight plagiarism.
Mm-hmm. Always reskin everything.
Right. Yeah. Put a different face on it, make it green, and give it a different special power.
Provided you have exercised due skill and therefore created something to create originality from the original product,
exactly.
Then it's copyrightable.
So we've got a question on deck, which is fairly relevant to what we've just been discussing. Do we have any tips on dealing with weird homebrewed rules that we want to develop? For example, Dragon Magpie is looking into a madness system, but the TTRPG ones they've looked at don't do what they'd like.
All right. Well, you know what? We could use that question to segue into what I had kind of lined up as the last section of this whole discussion anyway, which is writing game systems, or at least, or even if it is just homebrew rules, add-on rules to an existing system or whole new systems. If you're to start to answer that question, if you're talking about a subsystem, like a madness, again, this madness module, I'm going to call it, that you're going to add into D&D 5th or Pathfinder 2nd or Alternity or pick a system. The main thing you need to think about, or the main things, are, first of all, you're going to need to define the effects of that system in terms of the existing game mechanic. All right, so I'll use Pathfinder terms because I'm a little more familiar, but we can get the D&D equivalents or whatever too. When you say madness, what are going to be the impacts of that madness? All right, Pathfinder defines a number of conditions that affect somebody's ability to function and perform. There's a confused, there's an incapacitated, which is the worst one.
Yeah.
They have one called dazzled, which just means you're hyper-focused on something and can't focus on anything else. There are a few others. So ultimately, you're going to need to define, you're either going to need to define a whole new condition, which you then have to balance in light of all the other conditions. When you're talking about rule sets, whether it's a single homebrew rule or whether it's a whole system, all right, balance is the thing you need to always, always, always look at. All right, because if what you build isn't balanced, then your players will take advantage of it, or they will hate it because they feel, unfairly attacked, depending on which side of the balance you're falling on. So the best way to deal with balance is to, manipulate the rules, but stay within the rule boundaries. So for a madness system, like I said, if you could come up with a way to define it in the terms of the conditions that already exist in the game, go for it. In a way that becomes not much different, for example, than maybe the effects of some poison. And you might actually look at poison effects. If you were playing in Pathfinder, I would tell you, look at the poison system and the disease system and build your madness system to work like that, and you'll have something that'll fit in the game pretty well.
I just had a really random idea thinking about all this and going on about madness. Recently I've been playing Call of Cthulhu. Why not bring the sanity mechanic and change that and tweak that to D&D? Because some of the things you see in D&D is going to drive someone crazy.
Well, that brings us to the next bigger section of homebrew rules, I think. And before we even get into that, I'm going to ask a question. Why would you want to take the time and effort to create your own rule system? Or to do, I mean, we're talking beyond now just one extra, like a table rule that says, I don't count critical fails on an attack roll, or, those are minor things. I'm talking about, bringing in a sanity system, bringing in, changing the way combat works.
I think one of the benefits doing that is ultimately you get to augment the entire story from scratch.
Yeah.
You get the ability to change the dynamic, for example, instead of having a point-based system, it's with, so many points that you can allocate per thing. You get different spheres of influence that grow in XP and automatically, so you can change how the story progresses and then shaping the story around that. And I think that's one of the main benefits that I would see from writing your own rule set, is ultimately the main important thing in RPG is the story. Ultimately, you are telling a story. If you aren't having fun with it, then I think that's really defeating some point the point and the object of RPG writing. So being able to augment that story perhaps in a new way, and to be able to augment that in a more dynamic way, so you're less constrained with, like we have already said, with using systems like Pathfinder 5e and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, the existing systems out there run the gamut now. This is the other question too: is do you need to create your own system, or is there a system out there somewhere that fits what you want? You know, unfortunately, there's so many out there you may not be aware of it. I do not pretend to know every system out there, but I can tell you I'm familiar with the few that are at opposite extremes. And you know, we were talking about if you're really focused on telling the story, something like the storytelling dice system that some of the Star Wars games and a few other games use, where there's no numbers on the dice. There's symbols on the dice that indicate success or advantage or disadvantage or failure. You know, or catastrophic failure, or tremendous success. You know,
well, the FFG Star Wars system actually got extracted out from Star Wars and turned into a whole separate whole master system reference thing called
Edge
Genesis.
of Empire. Yeah, Edge of Empire. I mean, right down to just how you run a combat. All right, everybody rolls initiative, but the only thing that gets recorded in the initiative tracker is whether you're a player or an enemy. And then in every combat round, the players can decide, okay, we get slots 1 and 2 and 5 and 7. Who wants to go in slot 2? It might be the person who was in slot 7 last time.
Yeah.
You know, and the purpose of that, though, is to allow you to turn that whole sequence of combat into a story on its own. Yeah. You know, I moved here and I was ready to do this, and now that I'm ready to do this, I do it on the next turn, you know, and instead of I have to sit there and wait for 4 other people to move before I do it.
Having actually written a system reference document for an RPG, I can probably actually speak to the motivations and to some of the mechanics of that. The motivations for me came down to systems like D&D in particular, but also several others. The crunch in the system was getting in the way of the storytelling. And the crunch, the aspects that created the crunch didn't necessarily add anything to the story. So from that perspective, one of the things I did was create a system that basically used stacked situational advantages, stacked skill advantages. You had a roll plus your total bonuses, and rather than having to roll damage, you would actually roll the difference between your target, whether that be a roll from an opposing player or opposing non-player character or system or whatever, was simply subtracted from your own roll. And if that impact value was positive, then you gained the advantage. If the impact was negative, then they gained the advantage. Now, if you were doing a damaging attack in a combat situation, that would be applied as damage to your hit points, to your health. So there's no damage dice, it's just a single roll for every check. But I also dislike the table dynamics of initiative in D&D, etc. So what I did in that system is I actually created a different type of approach to it, where every player you just go around the table, doesn't have to be in any particular order. Each player declares what their action is going to be for a turn. GM works out what the situational advantages are. And what smart players will do using the system is help each other out so that one person is leading the overall effort for that particular round. Or you might have two players each being assisted by others. And their damage, their impact roll totals get added to the next players, or the impact of the player that's actually doing the targeted action. Play tested it. It's a little hard to wrap your head around at first, but after a while, the players who are largely D&D players who've tried that system did kind of come to say, okay, yeah, we get how this works, and we kind of like it. So, if you had a hacker trying to hack a system, the system would have a difficulty rating of, let's say, 35. Their skill gives them a bonus of, say, +5. So in order to reach the total of 25, they needed a bunch of extra situational advantages. So you could have another player, for example, trying to take down the power grid for the target system. You could have another player running a botnet on a different computer that was distracting the target system's defenses. That would add further situational advantage. You get the idea. And so then when as each of their impact rolls happen, they're stacked on top of the player who's actually doing the hacking, and then based on the overall impact, it could be quite significant. In combat, it means that you get the opportunity to collaborate to create knockout blows, which was quite an interesting mechanic as well, because it makes combat a little more lethal, but it also makes combat quicker, which, I don't know how many of you have spent, 3 hours dealing with a single large combat at the table. I'm sure most of you. And for some players just don't like that level of crunch.
Yeah, I've seen players before that just want to get on with it.
Yeah.
A little bit of combat, 20 minutes, half hour, move on, right, what's next?
Yeah.
I've had it where it's completely opposite, where actually most of my players don't actually want combat. All they want to do is stand around and talk and have social engagement, which, again, I think it comes down to, like we said right at the beginning, have a really good understanding of your players' expectations.
Yeah.
When you're writing something, write what's needed. Don't write everything and anything, especially from an RPG perspective. If perhaps you're then using that to make a novel, again, don't go start writing about elven shoes. You may perhaps add more additional context and build out a few profiles, but work out the story you want to tell, and I think the same rule applies to RPG. Work out the story you want to tell, roughly, and see where your engagement with your players goes. Don't railroad them, see where it ends up. And I think part of the fun of RPG writing, and especially homebrewing, is somewhat making it up as you go along.
Yeah, definitely. I guess the last topic, since we're starting to get close to time edge here.
Yep.
We're
just
talking
before
about
we dive into the last topic, we do have a question on deck.
Oh, sure.
When you are writing an adventure for another GM, how much detail do you put in? Also, is providing hand-holding instruction for the GM something that will turn away another GM from wanting to buy it or run it?
I could not have asked for a better segue. What I was about to actually mention was the last thing I wanted to talk about was, since this is a writers' convention, is if you're writing, whether it's a rule system or a campaign environment or an adventure series, but you're writing it hopefully for general consumption and not just for your table, what other considerations do you have to worry about? The first thing you bring up is exactly right. If I'm writing something for just myself, I might throw a few notes into the script, into the adventure script that said, don't forget to have
don't forget to do this check, don't forget to do that, whatever along the way. If you're writing, if you think you need the note yourself, then you can be pretty sure you want to put it in for somebody else. All right, that's my personal rule number one. I like to try to build adventures to require if I'm going to hand it off to somebody else to run, or if I'm going to sell it and somebody's going to buy it and try to run it, I would like to try to minimize. My number one concern is the amount of time lost in a game session looking up some minor obscure rule in a 600-page rule book. So one of the things I try to do in the adventure module itself is if I'm going to throw, if I'm going to throw in a poison that can generate the confused condition, I'm going to tell them what the confused condition is and does right there. Whether it's a sidebar, whether it's a little pop-out box or whatever, but I'm going to tell them right there what it is, so you don't have to go find it. Nothing kills game session more than the, hold on a second, let me look that up.
Yeah.
All right. and if you're going for immersion, if the whole idea is to immerse the party and get them, and get 4 players around a table believing they're in your world, every time they have to stop and pull out the book or pop up their laptop and go into whatever rule compendium they're looking for, every time you do that, now they've stepped out of your world, and now you got to pull them back in again.
Ultimately, I think the answer is if you are that rule, and obviously there are players, perhaps obviously us as a group are not rule lawyers. I am by no means a rule lawyer. I frankly just want to tell a good story, and I will make a decision and a judgment as time goes on. If that decision was wrong at the time, I will either retrospectively fix it afterwards, or, okay, right, that's the rule moving forward. Obviously, try and maintain fair application of the rules, but again, it's about that conversation, I think, and that's, I think, the main point in any of this. Obviously, RPG, writing, all of it is storytelling.
Yeah, but
what's the fundamental of storytelling? Communication.
Right, but if you're writing for a larger audience, if you're writing for a table that isn't yours, all right, then yeah, you do now need to think about certain things. A lot of the things we talked about, were things that could be resolved in a session 0. I expect this much balance. I expect that. Obviously, you don't get session 0. You as a writer don't get session 0 with all of the people that might possibly buy your product and try to play your adventure. All right. So that means you kind of have to anticipate, and I'm not going to say right to the extremes, but I would say, you need to, when you're writing, if you're writing it for somebody else's consumption, you need to take into account the fact that some of those consumers are going to be more the rule lawyer types than others. Some are going to be more story type than others. So you kind of have to satisfy both. Some of them are going to be, very railroady, and some of them are going to want to be more sandboxy. So you need to kind of deal with both there. You might want to provide 2 options. Some of them will be brand new GMs who don't know how to run a game. All right, so you might want to provide little tips in there. When the goblins attack, this is what they'll likely do. These 2 will split off to the left because there's cover, and they're going to go here, and these ones are, adding little things like that will increase the size of the product.
Or notes on how to role play a certain NPC.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Like with our game that we've recently.
Right. Stuff that you don't need. Stuff that you don't need if it's your NPC.
Yeah.
All right,
so,
but somebody else will. Yes, you do need to include
some of that, but then you also have to balance, okay, how much of this peripheral stuff am I throwing in compared to the core, to the core adventure script, and is it too big? And you need to, my advice there though too is to not incorporate it into the running script, but put a lot of these things in as sidebars or, again, little ad boxes, because that way the experienced GM doesn't have to worry about it. He can look at the sidebar and say, oh, I don't need that. All right. But the inexperienced GM can say, oh, thank God this is here.
Yeah. And I think, as Stretch mentioned, that sort of level of detail is helpful, but only as far as it helps you as the GM running that content immerse the characters in the writing. So as a writer, you if that piece of information is important, like you might say that the tavern keeper is a big fat man who wears a sweaty apron and is always glancing to his left. The only thing that might actually be required for that particular encounter for another GM is the fact that he's always glancing to his left, because there's another NPC down the end of the bar who he's nervous about. So, but knowing what to pick and choose as the information to disclose and what not to is, I think, an important part of that equation.
It's a little bit like when I was running.
So anyway, I'm looking at the time, and since at least two of us are doing another panel in 1 minute.
Yes.
By all means, gents, we'll wrap it up.
I'm going to suggest we kind of wrap it up here. Are there any other questions out there? I think we caught up with everything.
We've covered off all of the questions.
Excellent.
So let me transition out from the panel screen to the outro screen. I'll let you guys jump off and head to your next conference
Thank you
call.
so much, everyone.
I would like to thank everybody in the chat for putting up with us for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Some interesting questions, some interesting chat.
Definitely, I think we've covered a lot of ground and explored a real vast range of topics. So I think thank you for everyone in the chat for dealing with us. And,
we might have to make 2 or 3 different panels to replace this one next year.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe a longer stream.
Yes, definitely. And gentlemen, thank you for your time. It's been really great to have the benefit of your respective individual wisdoms and collective wisdom as a whole. I'll let you get offline, but is there anything you want to quickly plug regarding your own stuff? Like a link?
www.carterion.com, CARTYRION.com. That will bring you to the home page of my World Anvil world. Come explore.
If you go to my Twitch page on the About section, there's a link to my link tree. All my links are there.
Cool.
Same for me. Go to GreatGM, twitch.tv/GreatGM. I stream every Sunday at 11:30, plus various times throughout the week. Do drop in and say hi. And if you haven't already, give us all a follow.
Yeah. Okay.
Cool. All right. Thank you, gents. I will wind up the stream, and I'll get us across to the map making panel with a bunch of raiders.
Where you'll see us again. Yes,
indeed. All right. Cheers, guys. Thanks again.
I'll see you later.
All right, folks. So we have a final bit of admin to do, and that's that we need to create a raid message. That is going to be continuing CONduit. Seems to be the convention that has emerged. Add emoticons, emotes, emojis as you will, and we will kick off a raid to Bigfoot Björnsson, who is We'll copy link address /raid Bigfoot Bjornsson. Thank you all for your attention. It's been great, interactive, some really good questions. Dazzlercat in particular, you've asked a number of really good questions, so appreciate your attention and your interest in the topic. We will raid out now. Thanks all again, and we'll catch you next time.